Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
In fact, it is good morning, which just goes to prove that we pre-record that little bit to make sure that we get it right all the time. Welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast. For those of you listening live, it's 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. We decided, frankly, Koonsberger's had it all to herself for far too long, and we thought we'd try the morning slot. If you're listening to the delayed semi-live version, it's 6:27 if Simon's remembered to push the buttons at the right time. And if you're listening on podcast, well done. Give us 5 stars, rate and review. So here we are, Sunday morning. A bleary-eyed Simon. Who have we got this morning, Simon?
So this morning, as we go head to head with Peter Finlay on so this morning we are joined by Councillor Dan Wemyss from Hilsea Ward. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome, thank you for having me on, and apologies for getting you guys up early on a Sunday.
That's okay. That's okay. We're normally shouting at a television at this time in the morning anyway, so it's hopefully not too bad, and we don't look too bleary-eyed. But it's worth trying to see whether we can find our audience in the morning for a change. We'll see. But so we're here to talk about matters Hilsea with Dan, and then once we've kind of gone through those items, we're also going to have a bit of a preview in Tuesday's full council meeting, which is looking at at Portsmouth City Council's budget. So you can imagine that's going to be as exciting as that can possibly be. But we'll have a chat about that later on.
Well, we'll try and bring as much energy as we can to a potential 11-hour fist fight, but we'll see what we can do with it.
Okay, that's great. So I'll head off. So Dan, so couple of things that we wanted to talk about. One of them is with regards to pharmacies. Last year you were part of the campaign to stop Roland's pharmacy in London Road from closing. Can you remind us why this campaign was important at that time?
So a little over 12 months ago, basically, Roland's head office decided, well, I guess they were doing a restructuring, and they were looking at different pharmacies up and down the country and just seeing where they could obviously, I guess, do cost savings. And one of them was in London Road in Hilsea. And the way that the clinical mechanisms work is basically, if you're a pharmacy provider and you wish to close, then you can move all your patients over to a pharmacy that's close by, and that would have been in Kingston Road, which is obviously for a lot of residents in Hilsea not somewhere that is overly close, and indeed the closest one being Copner is quite a walk away, especially for those who are vulnerable or indeed may have a disability and can't make it that far. So at that point, when we heard that, the ex Hilsea councillor Scott Pater Harris and I, we decided to look at the provision and to see where we can keep that provision in Hilsea. So once we looked into that, we met with different providers and just to see if they're interested in taking over the pharmacy in Hilsea, and we also gave a deputation at the Health and Wellbeing Board, basically to exemplify residents' concerns and just say the demand is there. So if the demand can be proven, basically other providers can take over that site. We also strengthened a motion at full council which spoke about pharmacy provision and GP provision in general in Hilsea, and we decided that we could have strengthened that with an amendment, which we did. And then we led a petition which was created by residents to basically exemplify that once, to say, please don't close our pharmacy. A lot of us use it. And then furthermore to that, we also met with the people who worked at the pharmacy and basically asked, what their concerns were. And once we collected all that evidence and data, we put it to the Portsmouth Clinical Commissioning Group, as well as, like I said, the Health and Wellbeing Board. And the NHS basically said, yes, we can keep the provision, and another provider could bid for that. And we had people from up and down the country actually show interest for that site. So we had people from Birmingham all the way up from Newcastle. But we felt that, it wasn't our decision, but we felt that a local provider such as in Lally's would be the best one. So we met with them spoke through with them on what the best case scenario would be. And that's basically what happened. Kept the pharmacy open, and a lot of happy Hilsea residents can get their prescriptions and indeed some basic medical care.
Cool. Thank you.
So, Dan, the pharmacy's been saved, and just last week, the government announced that pharmacists were going to be able to effectively issue some common prescriptions to save people having to go to their GP. Do you see this as a welcome addition, or is this just putting more pressure on pharmacies, which we've covered before on the podcast, are having some issues in recruiting and retraining enough trained staff?
I'd say it's a number of measures that the government have recently released in the hope of obviously reducing waiting times and alleviating some of the pressure on, I would say, A&Es up and down the country. I mean, most people go to their pharmacy first before they go to their GP, so it only makes sense that we can strengthen what you can provide at the pharmacy, then hopefully we can take some of that pressure off GP practices. I'd say 10,000 pharmacies up and down the country are going to benefit from this £645 million worth of funding. Yes, there will obviously be some teething measures. That is the case with any large-scale policy such as this. But if you look at the crux of the matter, if you can get the people who see the most people in that community, bar GPs, to be actual offer some medical service, you can stop unnecessary appointments and actually be able to give GPs the time that they can obviously serve with more complicated procedures. I mean, it's going to take a few years. That's true, like to actually be able to streamline the service, but essentially all new pharmacists from memory are going to be able to prescribe. So if we can get the ball moving now, then obviously it's going to be a lot easier when these new pharmacists come in. And obviously we're trying to make sure, the government are trying to ensure that shortage of pharmacists is plugged. And this £645 million worth of funding helps to do that. I'd say, keeping the things they can prescribe for simple at the present will obviously mitigate risks, but it will also help alleviate that pressure I mentioned before. So I think it's only a good thing. And obviously, it isn't the silver bullet, but it's definitely something that can help. And I think in a few years' time, we'll see the benefit of that.
Cool.
Thank you, Simon.
Sorry. So I mean, looking at Hilsea specifically, Dan, what do you think is missing in the ward in terms of health provision, and who do you see as responsible for plugging that gap?
I think this might be one of the times where I actually agree with my ward colleagues on some issues, but I definitely say one of the things that is missing is a GP surgery, and I know that there's a lot of concerns by residents where there was the space at South Downview for that GP practice that was promised. It was way before my time, so I can't really comment on the ins and outs of what was agreed, but I know that there was something that was mentioned. Indeed, one of the concerns which we'll lead on to in a bit was talking about how we could have used the news centre site for such a provision. But I think, in Hilsea, spaces is hard to come by. If you can find somewhere to put a GP, it'd be fantastic. But at the end of the day, the people who make the decision is the Portsmouth Clinical Commissioning Group, and as well as the NHS England in general. And I think they have the responsibility. One of the things that I would say is, if you can have that grassroots campaign where you can show that there is a need for provision, then NHS England will listen. I mean, that was exemplified by the pharmacy campaign. But indeed, if it's down to that clinical commissioning group, if they can obviously put forward a service and indeed find a provider. That's one of the things. If you can't find a provider to give essential medical services, then you're not going to be able to open one up. So it's always a thing with local government, indeed with national government, indeed with everything else around it, with the NHS, is you need to put those people together in a room and actually discuss what needs to happen. I mean, you only have to look at what Penny Mordaunt did recently with the dentistry summit she held, and she was quite successful in getting everyone into a room and getting that national funding for extra dentists. So if we can do something similar with GPs, if the need is there, then perfect, it'd be brilliant. And I think that's something we could definitely look into. Moving forward, I mean, you only have to look at demographics within Hilsea. It's a growing population. Historically, it's older than younger. So if I would say a GP practice is needed, especially in the next 10 to 15 years. So I'm happy to look into that, and I definitely would push that to all people in senior leadership and different entities to take a look and see what is needed in the future.
Cool. So
Brilliant.
it's not as easy as finding a site. Then you've got to line up the who's going to actually fill it. You've got to find the money. So
Exactly. It sounds amazing in principle, and no one's against having more GPs. Like, everyone is obviously happy to support that. You just need to really look into the details, and that's one of the things that is always difficult, especially as a councillor. We're not experts in the medical field, we're not experts in a lot of things, but most of the things that I would say that a councillor does is you voice the concerns of residents, and what they see is on face value is we need GP and need a GP in Hilsea. So obviously I commend any councillor, indeed, and my ward colleagues for putting that forward.
brilliant.
Perfect. So, Dan, a little change of tack now. Anyone who's sort of driven into Portsmouth will know the iconic news centre as you come in through Hilsea, currently being demolished. And before that happened, there was a campaign to get the building listed. It's being knocked down to make way for the new electric bus depot. Did you share the thinking behind getting the news centre listed, or looking to save it?
I think with this, I always follow what residents want. So in this instance, we did look into listing the building, and obviously it's very, very difficult thing to do, and you only have to look at what's happening in Drayton with the pub obviously trying to be designated, and it's hard to work out the best approach. So we did look into it. Obviously it didn't happen. A lot of residents were upset. Some residents were happy. I'd say it's a very dividing line in Hilsea, with some residents wanting to see the building gone and just made into something new, and a lot of residents love the fact that it's that historical architecture that they really like. It's when you drive into Hilsea, drive into Portsmouth, it's one of the first things you see. And I would say, I always follow the majority when it comes to these things. So there's always going to be some unhappy people and happy people with the demolition. But the issue is that this case and scenario, it just didn't happen. And, there'll be other buildings across the city that will probably face similar campaigns, and it will have to see what happens. But in this case, it didn't happen.
So now that the decision has been taken to remove it, and as you said, the demolition's actually underway. Do you think that that's a positive outcome? Actually putting in that facility for an electric bus charging station, is that going to be a good thing for the community?
My personal opinion is it's a good thing. I think a fleet of electric vehicles that can serve the city and its residents is always a positive. My only concern, and this is shared with many people, is the manner of which the building's being demolished, and what consultation's been had with residents, and indeed what communication's been had with residents, because at present I would say it's not good enough. At the beginning of this scenario, we were promised a lot of things. Councillor Simpson, Councillor Strodwick and I, we met with First Bus and said, look, one of the things that we know the building's going to get demolished. We know we can see your plans. We'd like the idea of the bus fleet, but what we don't like is you're removing the entire building. So if there's anything you can keep that obviously can show this historical value of the site, that would be brilliant. So when we met with First Bus, they promised us to keep the pond area and some of the signage, some that hasn't been fulfilled. The other thing was the soundproofing along as you drive into Military Road. They were going to put some sound dampening. So basically when the demolition happened, it'd be less likely to impact residents, as well as when the building is erected, it would also stop some of the noise from some of the buses and cars, etc. However, I know with building works, there's always going to be issues, but one of the things that we weren't expecting was glass into the road, which happened obviously this weekend, which is ridiculous and not good enough. The other thing that isn't good enough is the lack of notice by the council during the planning phase. We raised copious amounts of concerns with that. If you want buy-in from residents, you need to communicate with them. The other issue was the consultation. What's the point of collecting all of this feedback if you're not going to implement some of it? So that's one of the problems I've had with the entire site. yes, it's the same thing with the GP, I guess. Like, it sounds great in principle, but how do you enact it? So if you're getting lots of residents complaining, then you're not doing things properly. And I'd say, yes, in maybe in 10 years, when you can see the fleet of electric buses that are serving the residents of Portsmouth, great. But it's always going to have that issue where historically you just remember the glass in the road, the noise going on at 6 a.m., which isn't good enough either. So it's very dividing. Personally, as I said, it sounds great in principle, but I don't like what the developer's doing, and I don't like that the first bus hasn't communicated with residents very well.
Do you think that's a common thing with developers in general? Do you think some do better at that than others? Is because, I mean, obviously building works, as disruptive as they are quite temporary, but is that just kind of like a given in your experience of what other developers do, that basically that's just going to be the case, or are others better at working with local communities?
I think there's always going to be those who you use as an example of best practice. And I would definitely say you can have the noise and you can have some of the issues. I mean, with the buildings as large as that, there's going to be problems, but it's the positive impact you have when you obviously speak to residents from the door and you say, look, we know there's going to be a lot of noise. How can we mitigate that? Here's my phone number. Some just simple things that like a lot of developers don't think of, which, you know, the communication side is, if you meet with residents regularly, you can take them with you. And that's one of the things that you need to get as a developer. You need to get resident buy-in for those who are surrounding, as well as, especially if it's a building that people are going to live in, like you need to obviously get buy-in there. But with the new centre site, there's going to be commercial space. There's going to be obviously a lot of people coming in and out. And if you can't show residents the positive impact it's going to have in the community, you're just not going to get that buy-in I mentioned earlier. So I would say there's always bad examples that you can have, but there's also good examples. But I would just say this: you just need to have good practice when you speak with the residents that you're impacted.
Cheers.
You've already touched on the fact that the issue has been quite divisive in terms of some residents supporting or some residents kind of in favour. In terms of Hilsea more generally, what you know, is it a case of residents are sort of looking for what developments are the residents really looking for?
I mean, when I speak to people on the door, when it comes to developments, they want to see a net gain in terms of how can I use this development as a resident. Like, one of the things I always put forward is, when anything's getting built in Hilsea, has it got the longevity? Is it having a positive impact up and down the demographic of those who live there? And indeed, what's the impact it's going to have while it's getting built? So one of the things that's always missing is obviously health provision, but finding a site is very difficult. Transport, I mean, this is getting built with the new centre, but obviously there's issues there. And then it depends what else. So, like, you know, Hilsea is changing. It's changing historically. It's very different to what it is now. But you just need to ask residents what they see. So at present, health provision is one of the biggest issues that residents want and are always constantly messaging me about. So I'd definitely say, when you speak to people on the doorstep, things such as more dentistry and more GPs is what concerns them.
Brilliant, Dan. That's been fantastic. Thank you ever so much for giving up your Sunday morning for us. And yeah, hopefully there'll be more to come, and we'll keep an eye on how these things evolve.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much for having me on. And yes, I look forward to the 12-hour meeting on Tuesday.
Yeah, no, plenty of snacks and caffeine, I think, is probably the answer. Although Mayor Tom Cole seems to channel his inner Klingon to try and keep the meetings much briefer than they used to be.
He's done very well. I appreciate that. You know, we don't always need to hear the same thing over and over again from different councillors. So he's quite good at cutting people off when they need to be. But yeah, no, I look forward to it. I mean, I've heard stories that people used to order Domino's and KFC, and so I might see if I can reignite that old tradition and order some food.
Marvellous. Thank you ever so much, Dan.
Other food service delivery providers are available.
I'm vegetarian now, so yeah, I can't. My days of KFC are behind me, but yeah, I'm sure other people will order it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and yeah, have a good weekend.
Cheers, Dan.
Cheers,
See you
Dan.
later. Bye.
Bye. So, yeah, good to hear from Dan about the about those issues. Hopefully, something positive coming out of the broader landscape with pharmacies. And it remains to be seen what happens with the finishing of the development on the news centre.
Yeah, and it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because the news centre debate discussion for me echoed, the debate of, good Lord, I'll probably be out by 10 years, 20, 25 years ago, when the decision was made to knock down the tricorn. It was a development that sort of was quite iconic in terms of Portsmouth, but clearly was not fit for purpose or function for the sort of modern world. And the news centre, and I guess this speaks to how the world has changed. A giant building, still called the news centre, but I don't know how many years ago the news moved out of the news centre. But those big kind of 70s style, I don't know, 60s or 70s, those pieces of architecture, striking as they may have been, not sound, not easy to insulate, not cheap to run, big, just isn't a thing that people need anymore, or businesses want. So, was always going to be a challenge, to find a function for it. And ultimately, I guess that's why it's currently got a wrecking ball going through it.
Yeah, it's just it is the changing landscape of our media, the changing environment of the technology that means that we can, to be honest with you, I don't think I actually bought a newspaper more than I think I possibly bought one once in the last 5 years. And I'm sorry to say I haven't bought a copy of the the evening news probably in the last 15 years. So that's the struggle that local news companies like the news are facing. At the same time, technology moves on. At the same time, they're funding. They're basically trying to find a way to fund it. It's obviously a constant. You and I have spoken often about the frustration of ads on news websites. But if you're not paying, someone else has to. So there's got to be a way that they can make their bread and butter. But it's just not the way that we print things anymore. Even and we don't really predominantly absorb our news on a piece of dead tree.
No, and it's fascinating looking back. I remember sort of 40, and this is 40 years ago, where as well as the evening news on a Saturday, the news would produce a paper called the Sports Mail on pink paper, and it was a case of, and this gives you an idea of how the world has changed. So their kind of objective was that they would get the paper printed out and into newsagents after the Pompey game had finished, and before the newsagent closed at sort of, they had this sort of 90-minute window. And I remember as a boy being sent down to the newsagent. You didn't go too soon, because if you went at 6 o'clock, the paper wouldn't be there. And if you went at 25 past 6, it was a race to get there before they closed at 6:30, to get the Sports Mail. And when you look at that now, you think, wow, what an endeavour, to try and get that into the hands of people, in such a narrow window. So yeah, I think the world has changed and moved on, and yeah, I think we're I don't think we're ever going back. So so let's look ahead. Tuesday, the grand budget meeting, which is, as we said last year, was all very harmonious. You've been casting your eye over, what's on the agenda for this Tuesday. let me. Could I just gently gaze into my crystal ball, and without having done the research, would the council be suggesting a 4.99% council tax rise this year?
It's amazing, Ian. It's
Ah,
like you've read my notes, or
ah,
just remember from the last. I can't remember how many years it's been since there wasn't the total. So here's you're right on the money. The slightly expansive answer is that the council are allowed to increase the council tax by a maximum of 2.99% without having to have a referendum actually of the residents of the city to allow them to actually increase it by more. But in addition to the 2.99% for the increase in the council tax contribution, there's also the percentage they're allowed to actually charge a precept for social care, and the maximum for that is 2%. So that's kind of where that comes from. Obviously, overall, you've also got the precepts for the fire and for the police, which kind of brings it all into line. But it's yes is the short answer. Is that's what the game is on Tuesday. The question is, will it be like other years where pretty much everybody understands that this needs to happen because the financial situation that the council finds itself in, with reductions in local government funding from central government, with the increases in costs that it's found, obviously, all of those increases that businesses and residents have found with the cost of living crisis, the council won't be immune to. So it has to try to cover those while also being alert to the fact that increasing council tax is obviously an increase on a bill for council taxpayers.
yeah, and I think just to cut in there, Simon, I think, again, whilst I'm being playful, I think, if you look at inflation since the last budget, it's probably averaged out, um, you know, uh, closer to double digits than single digits. And, again, when you look at some of the key indicators like, the living wage, which, a lot of either council employees or subcontracted council employees, particularly when we're talking about adult social care, that rise was the best part of 10%. And if you know the if in terms of numbers, an awful lot of people who are paid by the council have seen their wages increase by double digits, then obviously has got to lead to some kind of wage inflation, because if the operator gets a 10% rise and now earns more than the supervisor or the team leader, so I think the vast majority of people kind of recognise that the council, their bills have gone up by a significant percentage, and their ability to increase their income is limited to 4.99%.
Yeah, indeed. And we won't kind of go through we won't break out the kind of the line by line on the budget items, but essentially that's the odd thing, is that with previous council meetings, everybody understands that that's the landscape that they're operating in. What seems to be the political level of the drama in recent years has been that there seems to be I wouldn't say a merry-go-round, but a kind of a musical chairs of one group or another will seem to be offended that they've been left out of so-called secret conversations or secret backdoor discussions with another group on the council that they had with the administration, and it kind of just seems a bit. Surely everybody can understand that who the administration is, and and everybody can count, so they know how many votes they have and how many votes the opposition parties have, and also that a budget needs to be passed, otherwise the council can't do its business and can't do its job of all of the mandatory things that it needs to do for the residents of the city. Then do we need the kind of the political? But you didn't ask us.
Well,
You know where everybody is, can't you? All just sit down
yeah,
and talk it through. Is that I don't know.
Well, I guess that's a chicken and egg discussion, isn't it? Because the way the numbers work is quite clear, isn't it? So the Lib Dems are a minority administration, but they basically need one of the other three groups, and I know there are more than three groups, but if we look at the major groups, the Conservatives, the Labour Party, and the Portsmouth Independent Party, if they get the support of any one of those three, then their budget passes. It's as simple as that. So there is an element of, in purely pragmatic terms, politically, if you're the Lib Dems, yes, you could sit down with all three of those groups, and there are some other kind of either non-aligned independent who who will give you another 2 or 3 votes. But there's an element of, if you do a deal with any one of those three, then your budget passes. So, and I think this is where, whilst we don't want to go through everything line by line, I think what we saw in last year's debate is the latitude or the wiggle room that the council has got is very small.
Yeah.
Because you've got to do adult social care, you've got to do children's social care, you've got the precepts for the fire and the police, you've got statutory obligations that you have to fulfill. Well, increasingly, when you cut those slices from the pie, the segment that's left, which we could describe as discretionary spend, is really quite small.
Yeah, indeed, and I think that's the that's the reality that everyone seems to be playing to. I think obviously the budget comes a couple of months before May's local elections, so there's always kind of political space to be made on, well, these are the things we would have done differently, and the administration basically didn't want to do what we wanted to do. I guess if you have a conversation, there's always going to be things of, there are some things that you wanted that we, that basically that overall can't happen, and likewise for everybody else. You can't, it's the art of compromise, isn't it? There are some things that you would have done differently. There are some slightly different things in style or substance, and those can sometimes be kind of made quite a big thing of on political leaflets, but fundamentally you're trying to draw from the same pot, and as you say, it seems to be you're trying to divide up the cake into you're trying to divide up a shrinking cake into actually ever larger pieces, which kind of doesn't really work. So I think I've mixed my metaphors thoroughly.
I think you possibly have, but I think the key point that we can all agree on is that we'll use your pie cake metaphor, that isn't getting bigger every year. The segments being taken out of it are bigger every year, and the amount that's left that's discretionary is smaller. But I guess the really big questions, which are the ones that seem to be posed, is that, again, it's about those choices of services that you fund and support and those that you don't. The other questions that I think have been posed historically is about, is there the ability of the council to generate more revenue?
Yeah,
I think there's something in or something we touched on. There was something around council tax charged for second homes. Does that appear anywhere?
It does indeed. So yes, so one of the things that that's being proposed, so one of the things on the agenda is actually about the council. The council basically, so from the 1st of April, in 2025, it will be able to levy 100% premium on council tax for second homes in the city, and that's going to net about 1.6 million. So that's about it's only about 977 properties. So that's quite a significant kind of addition to the council expenditure. Council coffers. But also the other thing that they're moving forward with was the other, and these were all parts of the Levelling Up Act that had basically come into force, that allows councils to charge these levies on second homes, but also on what it calls substantially substantially unfurnished empty properties. And previously the plan had been to charge 100% on homes that had been substantially unfurnished and empty for 2 to 5 years. But now that's actually come down to from 1 year. And that basically doing that a year earlier is going to net about 600k or so. So, again, these aren't small and inconsiderable sums that we're talking about. And indeed, at a time when people are struggling to find housing, and the cost of housing is, the supply and demand equation that's never more prescient than in an island city that just doesn't have more space. The premium, if they've been empty for more than 5 years, it's 200%. If it's been empty more than 10 years, it's 300%. So if anything, that might, rather than being a cash generating source, that might perhaps free up some properties in the city. So either way, that kind of helps. But from a cash perspective, obviously that's there's a fair sums there that kind of goes to help. But it's
it's the thing that always worries me about those, and I think it's a perfectly fair and reasonable tax to charge. I do wonder though whether it's one of those ethereal taxes which you never quite collect. If we look at a national level, Labour have been very, very vocal about closing the non-dom status and how many millions or billions that will raise. There's always a bit of me that says, well, if you are astute enough to manage your tax affairs as a non-dom, then I'm fairly certain that once that legislation comes in, you'll find a different way to manage your tax affairs, which means that you won't be paying the millions upon billions of pounds. And I do worry about this one, that people do have, the second home piece is, and I was surprised when you said it was 977. I guess it must be that there must be certain definitions around the second home, because I can't believe that in a city the size of ours, that people who own a second house and use it for rental purposes, to generate income for themselves, I can't believe there's less than 1,000 of those in our entire city. So, what, as you said, what it might do is stimulate some of those properties to come onto the market as people look at it and go, well, it was nice to have, but if that's now going to be £300 a month council tax for a house I don't live in, I'll liquidate it and sell it. So there is a worry for me that this might be a tax that never, you give people effectively by saying from the 1st of April 2025. I wonder how many of those homes will get liquidated onto the market before a penny in tax is ever collected.
I guess there's an element of taxation has two results, doesn't it? It drives behaviour, and it drives and it basically creates revenue, and there's a sliding scale and a balance between them of how much does what. Yeah. And just to clarify, these would be properties not that are a landlord, for example, owning a property and renting it out. These would be someone having, for example, a second home, for example, a holiday home in Portsmouth. That isn't basically predominantly occupied. So it's not one that they would would be on the rental market. It's basically just a home that you would for example, if you're in a situation, I'm plucking out of thin air, you've got a nice apartment in Gunwharf that you come and spend your summers in, or whatever.
Yep.
It's, so yeah, like you say, it remains to be seen just how much. It looks good on paper that these would be able to net these sorts of revenues. It remains to be seen whether they will in fact actually net that, or just change the behaviour so that people avoid it. But it's the council is just in a situation where it's just trying to find ways to increase its funding in a variety of different ways.
Yeah.
Thankfully, Portsmouth hasn't made some of the, or so many. I mean, I'm sure there have been some failures of financial decisions with investing in commercial markets, but it hasn't made some of the catastrophic failures of decisions that other councils have, and we're not in a situation where we're having to turn around to the government and say, that's it, we're out of money, we've got no money left, gov, you take over. We're not, we're not calling in a section 151, so you don't have to look very far down the M27 for examples of that.
Yeah, no, good use of section 151. No, and I think this is, whilst we are not, neither of us footballists, the classic Portsmouth Southampton divide does come into play here, because Southampton City Council is in a world of financial hurt, and it is, if it's not already in that situation, it's rapidly heading towards it. So I think we do have to acknowledge that whilst there is a little bit of political shenaniganery that will go on, and as you say, there'll be some leaflet fodder in terms of we proposed more money for the tiny children and the horrid Lib Dems said no, or there is going to be a bit of that going on. I think one thing we should be, and I'm going to use the word grateful to the whole council for over probably the last 10-15 years, is that they have run a balanced budget. They have had to collectively make difficult decisions about the balance between spending and income, and we're not Southampton.
For many reasons we should be grateful that we're not Southampton, although I found myself recently visiting it for different reasons. Well, no, I was thinking of my dad's stay in hospital.
Yes,
Southampton.
yes.
So, as difficult as that was to get to, but that's a different kettle of onions, as some would say. So, yeah, it remains to be seen, kind of what happens, how long that meeting will be, how much of the combat, so-called, in the chamber on Tuesday will be faux combat, and how much of it will be just kind of acceptance of, look, this is a situation. There isn't a magic money tree, and to be honest, my council tax increasing by £70 to £90 a year isn't really the end of the world for me. But lots of people in the city aren't in that situation, and that really will make a difference to them.
Yeah, and it's that element of, as you say, it's that element of 5% versus 3%. It's something we all we can all posture about, but it's almost it's one of those things that just happened. When I was a regular rail commuter to work, it used to drive me mad that every year at the end of January there would be a rail prices are going to go up by X%, and it's like, well, yes, they are, and they were always going to, and it's not like you didn't know it was coming. And then there is that piece where they've gone up by 10, by 6% this year, and you'd wander into the ticket office and you'd pay for your return to Havant and find it was like 15p dearer. And whilst 15p is 15p, and I'd rather have it than not, it wasn't going to change the world or break the bank. So like you say, if you're down to your last few coins, then obviously any rise is going to cause you massive pain. But I guess it's that element of again, if it's going to cost you £150 a year for a 5% rise, then £60 a year less if it was only 3%. £5 a month, £1 a week, is a deal breaker if you haven't got an extra £1 a week, but it probably isn't going to make an enormous amount of difference. So, anything else shouting out from the agenda? Or is that the key highlights?
Yeah, those are the kind of the key things. I mean, there are some projections about kind of the next 3 years about actually, you talked about balanced budget, about entering into deficit. So there's definitely kind of alarm lights flashing about the continued kind of pressure on local government funding, and accepting as a given that for the 25-26 financial year that the council is going to have to find savings of at least £1 million. So you can continue to be innovative, I guess, and continue to find ways to save, but there has to be kind of a you can always there's always something you can find, but the low hanging fruit, the easy stuff is already been plucked bare. Yet now you're kind of looking for the really, really kind of hard to do. And I should imagine, like most organizations, the stuff that would really drive productivity and efficiency also requires a painful level of investment in order to deliver. The number of times I think on budgets that they've kicked down the road replacing one computer system or another, bearing in mind how awful government institutions seem to be about replacing computer systems. And that's why, some of them end up retaining systems that are no longer secure or no longer maintained by their provider, that are literally stuff that's knocking around from like the 90s. That's why, because they're never in a situation where they're able to bite the bullet and say, this is how much it's going to cost to replace.
Yep.
And actually get that done. So it kind of becomes an ever kind of painful cycle. But thankfully we've got some really clever and astute people that do that for us and kind of make those decisions. But we'll see how that conversation goes on Tuesday and see how long that meeting lasts. What's your thoughts on how long it's going to be?
Well, we've got the Mayor Tom Coles, his recent form has been excellent in this regard, hasn't it? He definitely channels his inner Klingon to make sure that the meetings kind of run to time. So
he doesn't have to get out his backleth that quite so
no.
he doesn't swing his backleth around the room. So
no, but I think we could. I'm going to back Tom Coles and say I reckon we'll be done by 6:30.
Okay. I must admit I feel I had a feeling of kind of something similar, but will remain to be seen. Our chats with others, maybe they feel that it won't be quite as plain sailing. Who knows? We'll find out, and that's what we'll report on next week.
Absolutely. So you've been listening to the Pompey Politics podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sainsbury. So do join us at our usual time next week, where we're reporting on how that full council meeting went and whether the drama was over anticipated or whether it just turned out to be acceptance of the numbers on the page. But do click those links if you want to have a look at that meeting, and do remember to like us wherever you're listening to us, and follow and subscribe. And we'll see you next week.